April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. The Pacific glowed with the first light of dawn, but the waters around Okinawa did not shimmer peacefully. They boiled with steel as more than 500 American ships blanketed the horizon, carrying 180,000 soldiers and Marines. Ahead of them lay Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, a place that would become both a gateway to Japan and a graveyard. Barely 400 miles from the mainland, its capture promised the Allies a base for the final assault. Yet beneath that promise loomed a price so monstrous that even before the first step ashore, men sensed something unnatural in the air. The landings seemed almost too easy, eerie in their silence. Marines waited ashore braced for withering fire, only to find beaches strangely deserted. Some laughed nervously, joking that perhaps the Japanese had forgotten they were coming. But every seasoned officer knew this was no gift. It was a trap coiled tighter than anything yet faced in the Pacific. General Mitsuru Ushijima had chosen not to defend the sand, but the stone. His army had dug deep into the hills, carving bunkers, tunnels, and caves into the bones of the island itself. The beaches were not battlefields. They were bait. When the jaws closed, Okinawa erupted violently into a burning hell on earth. Hidden caves spat machine gun fire into advancing columns. Artillery rained invisibly from ridges that looked empty until they burst into flame. Soldiers advancing through the villages were torn apart by gunfire so sudden it seemed the earth itself had betrayed them. Japanese soldiers appeared from tunnel mouths like phantoms, charging with grenades clutched to their chests, screaming through the smoke before vanishing in an explosion of blood and dust. The Americans answered with crushing force. Napalm sprayers belched fire into cave mouths, turning rock into ovens and men into silhouettes against orange walls. Grenades rolled into black tunnels, followed by muffled concussions that threw dirt, smoke, and fragments of bone back into the daylight. Hills were pulverized until they were nothing but jagged stumps littered with scorched corpses. Progress was measured not in miles but in feet, every advance clawed from stone soaked in blood. Above the island, the sky became its own theater of horror. Kamikaze planes screamed down from the clouds, their engines howling like beasts driven mad. Pilots welded themselves to death, plunging their aircraft into destroyers, carriers, and battleships with suicidal precision. Explosions split decks, firestorms engulfed steel corridors, and sailors were hurled into the sea, bodies thrashing amid burning oil slicks. Survivors spoke of the sound of screaming engines moments before impact, of comrades vanishing in eruptions of fire so sudden that nothing remained but blackened water and drifting wreckage. In a single week, more than 150 ships were struck, some sinking in minutes, leaving men clawing at waves thick with fuel and flame. On land, the fight tightened around ridges whose names became etched in memory as epitaphs: Kakuzu Ridge, Sugarloaf Hill, the Shuri Line. Each position was a fortress, a labyrinth of dugouts, machine gun nests, and tunnels linking the living and the dead. To take them meant storm after storm of frontal assaults, men charging uphill through sheets of bullets, clods of earth spraying where rounds struck inches from their faces. At Sugarloaf Hill, the battle devolved into weeks of madness, grenades tossed back and forth like baseballs, bayonets flashing in the mud, Marines dragging comrades down slopes only to collapse in exhaustion beside them. The ground grew slick, not with rain, but with blood. Survivors said the hill itself seemed to breathe death, as if its soil was made from corpses. Civilians suffered in equal measure. Okinawa was home to nearly 300,000 people, and their world became a furnace. Families fled through smoke-choked valleys, only to stumble into artillery barrages. Mothers clutched infants while propaganda whispered that surrender meant torture and humiliation. Convinced, some threw themselves and their children from cliffs into the surf below. Villages burned, their ashes carried on the wind with the stench of cordite and flesh. Caves echoed with terrified whispers, civilians too afraid to emerge, starving in the dark while battles thundered above. The Island IS tragedy was no longer just a clash of armies, it was a collapse of humanity itself. By May, the landscape bore no resemblance to the Okinawa that had existed before. Forests were stripped to blackened stumps, hills were hollowed and scarred, their insides charred from fire and explosives. Villages were erased, their people scattered or dead. The Americans pushed on relentlessly, their faces gaunt, their uniforms reeking of sweat, rot, and smoke. Sleep was a rumor, rest, a stolen minute with one's back against rubble. General Ushijima's men, dug deep in the Shuri line, fought with the certainty of death. Every cave was a tomb waiting to be sealed. Every tunnel had to be taken with fire, with steel, with screams. Okinawa was not a battle. It was a nightmare without end. By June, Okinawa had become a vision of hell. After nearly 3 months of relentless combat, the American flag rose above shattered ridges and smoking ruins. But no one cheered. The island was secured, yet the cost was monstrous beyond imagination. More than 12,000 Americans lay dead. 36,000 more were wounded. Across the battlefield, the Japanese toll dwarfed it. Over 100,000 soldiers, almost all refusing surrender, cut down where they fought or buried alive in collapsed tunnels. And threaded through that carnage was a civilian tragedy beyond measure, as perhaps another 100,000 Okinawans perished, caught between two armies, their island transformed into a graveyard. The Americans named it the Typhoon of Steel, not as poetry, but as grim truth. Steel had rained from the skies, torn men apart on the ground, and churned the seas into floating pyres. Veterans recalled it not as a victory, but as survival, a storm of metal and fire that drowned everything human. The mud, the rain, the screams, the endless smell of burning flesh. They clung to memory with a cruelty more permanent than scars. Some soldiers confessed they could no longer eat roasted meat, the odor too close to what the wind had carried on Okinawa. Stories from the carnage burned themselves into history. Marines told of caves echoing with the cries of civilians, voices pleading from darkness until flames sealed them silent. Japanese soldiers, knowing death was near, scribbled final poems into diaries, then pressed grenades to their chests in ritual suicide. Sailors remembered kamikazes diving so low they could see the pilot's eyes before impact. Moments later, watching friends vanish in eruptions of fire that split steel like paper. One destroyer sank in 6 minutes after being struck, men still trapped below decks pounding on hatches as the sea closed over them. Even at the end, General Ushijima embodied the refusal to surrender. With his command collapsing, he chose seppuku over capture, his final words urging his people to endure what lay ahead. His death sealed the fate of Okinawa's defenders, and with it, the island itself became a monument to the absolute cost of resistance. The scars on Okinawa were not measured only in numbers. Hills were gouged open, their stone blackened and melted. Forests lay flattened, reduced to ash where once there had been green. Entire villages disappeared, replaced by craters, wreckage, and shallow graves. Survivors wandered dazed, barefoot among ruins, their faces hollow, their clothes stiff with salt and soot. Children stumbled past burned-out tanks, their cries swallowed by silence. The war had not simply taken lives. It had stripped away the very sense of a world that could recover. For the Allies, Okinawa became more than a battlefield. It was a warning, a terrible prophecy of what awaited if the Japanese homeland itself were invaded. The ferocity of the defense convinced leaders that to storm Japan's shores would mean millions dead. Oceans of blood poured for every mile. It was this shadow that fell across Hiroshima and Nagasaki months later. The atomic bomb had not yet been dropped, but its justification was already written in the charred soil of Okinawa. And yet, beyond strategy and history, Okinawa remained above all a memory carried by those who endured it. Soldiers woke years later to the thunder of imagined barrages. Sailors still smelled smoke when storms rattled their ships. Civilians, those who lived, bore wounds of silence, remembering families lost to fire or cliffs, to propaganda and despair. In diaries and whispered confessions, the island lived on not as triumph but as wound, a reminder that even victory could feel like annihilation. When the guns finally fell silent, Okinawa lay in ruins, a broken land that had paid a price no soil should bear. From the cliffs where families had hurled themselves into the sea, to the ridges where men fought hand to hand until nothing remained but corpses in mud, the island stood as both triumph and tragedy. It was the last great battle before the war's end, the threshold to Japan, and a graveyard carved in stone and memory.